Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Joining us here on the program today is Gregory Levy. He is author of the book, How to Make Peace in the Middle East in 6 months or Less. That's without leaving your apartment. He's been on the Beyond 50 radio program before as we talked with him about his book, Shut Up, I'm Talking, and that's where he had the opportunity to go to the Middle East and actually be a speechwriter for the Israeli government. And I'm going to tell you that if you didn't get the opportunity to read that book or understand what kind of a experience he had, believe me, it's been a strange one. And I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Mr. Gregory Levy. Gregory, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Now,
good to be back.
You must be somebody who starts looking back and saying, how did I ever get into all this mess in the first place? Tell us how all this got started.
Yeah, it's been a very strange path. I mean, how it all started was, what I outlined in my first book, which is basically, I was 25 years old. I was in New York City. I'm not Israeli. I'm actually Canadian. And I was in law school, and I was just super bored by law school, just beyond belief bored. And I applied to a bunch of internships, and one of them was at the Israeli consulate in New York. Got called into an interview, and this guy, and I figured, oh, great, I got the internship. And the guy I'm meeting with says, actually, we don't offer internships. And I say, oh, what am I doing here? And he says, actually, our deputy speechwriter left, and our head speechwriter is leaving, and we wanted to know if you'd be interested in a full-time job instead of an internship as the head speechwriter for the Israeli ambassador to the UN. And, of course, I thought I was on candid camera, but that's how it all started.
Now, you found that the way of thinking from Israelis and, of course, Pakistanis and all that is a lot different than we would perceive. It's not as black and white as people think it is because they scratch their heads and say, these guys have been going through this for, it seems like, centuries, and it seems like it's never going to end, but then the U.S. news and our government always seems to think that, well, no, we're almost to a solution. I remember Jimmy Carter back in the 1970s, where, it seemed like it was inevitable, we were finally going to see peace, but then one of the guys gets assassinated. So you kind of wonder, what's really going on here?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, for this new book where I sort of went around talking to people from all over the political spectrum, mostly in the United States, but elsewhere too, one of the people I encountered said to me, I said, I'm trying to make peace in 6 months. How do I do it? Because that's sort of, the guiding light here in this book. And he says, oh, you have a wonderful North American naivete about you. He says, that's very nice. It's very optimistic. But basically, that's foreign to the Middle East. And I think this American optimism, which has some great stuff to say about it, but to them it sort of rings as unrealistic. And that's both to the Israelis and the Palestinians, who just, for the most part, are just see themselves as stuck in this mire.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your book, you were talking about, and this is, what was said in your book was about the possibility of American Jews, so to speak, being like that secondary American delegate, if you will, that had the money, the lobby, and the funding. And I found that was kind of interesting because as I was reading about that, I kept remembering about Jimmy Carter's book and where he talks about how there can be a resolution in the Middle East, and actually outlines and explains what's going on, what the factions are between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And when he was out doing his book tour, if you get the opportunity to see The Man from Plains, which was the documentary about Jimmy Carter, there's this big anti-Semite, debate that's going on to where it seems that it got distracted from the book, and it seems any time that we kind of step into this territory, that's going on. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's true. It just becomes sort of a shouting match, and that was actually sort of the impetus for me doing this book, which was after the first book and my other experiences with the Middle East. I was sort of sick of the way that people from the far right, the far left, Jews, Arabs, non-Jews, the right wing, the left wing, everyone's got something to say, and I would get tons of emails and phone calls and letters about the Middle East, and everyone thinks they can solve it. And then if you were ever to write something or have an opinion, you immediately get attacked from a million sides. So certainly people who are breaking a bit with the establishment line will immediately often be criticized, which is fine. Criticism's okay, but it does sort of distract from the core issues. You end up in this shouting match rather than sitting down and talking through the issues, which was sort of my goal in this book, was to try to get people to actually do that.
Now, Gregory, if you can, for our listening audience, talk about, from your experience, what it is that's been causing this ongoing conflict in the Middle East in the first place between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
Wow, that's a big question.
Sure. Well, you had a big book that you were talking about in your book.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, actually, a couple of the people I spoke to, they would say, well, to really understand what's going to happen in the future, what's going to happen now, and, we just had these peace talks in Washington, and there's going to be more soon, but to understand how we're going to go forward, you have to look back. And it's complicated. The story isn't black and white, but essentially we have a piece of land. They call it a twice-promised land. A piece of land that two peoples have claims to, whether or not you believe they're legitimate claims on either side. It doesn't matter. The point is you have two nations who think they have this same plot of land, and they're sort of stuck together. They're locked, and it's not even just that they're sort of occupying the same plot of land. It becomes so much more complicated, and that they're layered on top of each other. They each layer religious rights against each other. I mean, it's just a mess. So I clearly can't give a clear answer to that.
Crazy stuff there. And now, what has been the U.S. role in all of this? I mean, it seems that we kind of decided we want to protect the Israelis and go in that direction, but what's really going on there?
Well, that's an interesting point as well. Something I discuss a lot in the book is, where does the U.S. fit into this? So under the Bush administration, the American government basically decided to keep a hands-off approach. And that, for better or worse, that was the idea. It was to let the two sides either, duke it out or hopefully negotiate themselves, but not to put pressure, not to exercise American might. The Obama administration, from basically from day one, or even from the campaign, has indicated that they want to put some American, pressure on the situation to sort of move things along. And actually, I mean, it's very true. We're not even 2 years into the administration, and they're already working on this, which I think is very interesting, because if you look back at prior administrations, you often see that presidents start to engage with it in their second term, either because they're desperate for some achievement, or they've got no one left to anger at this point, but nothing left to lose. But to go into the first term in such a forceful way is a very interesting thing, and it could bode well because it is a change. But one last thing on that is that if in the book where I talk to people from all over, it is debated whether or not that's a good thing. In other words, whether or not the Americans really should be sticking their noses in. And that's from both an American perspective, whether it's in their U.S. interests, or whether the parties in the region could benefit from it. But certainly I think we do have a shift here, where you have the American government trying to broker something early on, and not as sort of a last-ditch plea in its last year of a second-term presidency. So we'll see.
Now, you decided to approach this by approaching somebody at a produce stand. Tell us about that.
Yes. Just near my apartment, there is a produce stand run by a Palestinian gentleman. And my idea for this book was that, we've heard so much, and we always hear so much from these talking heads on TV or on the radio, but we don't hear really enough from the man on the street. And I'm not talking about in the Middle East. I'm talking about here in North America, in Canada, or the United States. I'm currently standing in Canada. And this guy, he's Palestinian. He's actually from Lebanon, but he's of Palestinian descent. And I just sort of started trying to use him as my geopolitical advisor. It was a bit of an odd situation. I think he thought I was hitting on him, to be honest. But I'd go in there buying produce all the time and trying to sort of pull him into the discussion, and he's actually engaged with the situation more recently. He's lived on the ground. He knows it from a first-person perspective, and I think that is. And then I would do the same thing on the Israeli side, of course. And so I think that was an interesting way to look at it, rather than all the pundits and stuff who fly into Jerusalem, meet for 2 weeks, and then fly out.
Right. Because as you said, this really isn't a black and white issue, that it's a lot more complex than that. Share with us why that is. if you can.
Yeah, sure. I mean, people will divide into the Israelis and the Palestinians, for example. But we have so many factions, like you mentioned earlier, within that. To give just one example, we had these peace talks in Washington just a few days ago, and you had I think the night before or something like that, the day before, the shooting of Israelis by a Palestinian gunman. Now, the Palestinian was Hamas. Was a Hamas-sponsored attack. So, but it was done to embarrass the Palestinian Authority, who's mostly the Fatah faction. So it's starting to get a little more complicated already. However, it was under Palestinian Authority-controlled territory in the West Bank, whereas Hamas controls Gaza. You have just different divides like this. Meanwhile, on the Israeli side, you have, the settlers who immediately that very day said, "Oh, we're going to start building new settlements to scuttle the peace talks," in the same way that Hamas is trying to do. And you had the left-wing or left-leaning Israelis pushing against that. So the idea that, I know, that's just to name a few little groupings. The idea that you have two major groups is a very black and white approach to it, whereas there's a million nuances. And even in the United States, in Washington, there's a million push and pull forces going on. And in this book, my book's humorous, but it has to deal with these serious issues. In the book, I really would encounter so many little nuances and splits, and even in the left-leaning peace movement, that would split further. And I mean, at some point, it's just this giant fractured mess. And the more you delve into it, the more complicated it seems.
Now, you actually gave an example in your book of a particular video game that you played of how to make peace in the Middle East, and you found that you were actually raising tensions and causing more problems than you were solving. On the other hand, it seemed that your wife had it all figured out. What was going on there? Yeah,
there's this very interesting video simulator, I'm not sure what they call it. It's sort of a video game called Peacemaker. And I think it's free online. You can even play it. I'm promoting Peacemaker, I guess. I should tell the company. They don't even know I'm doing it. But Peacemaker, you sort of plug in whether you want to play the Israeli leader or the Palestinian leader, and there's a million little sort of factors at play. Not as much as in the real world, but quite a few. Are tensions rising? Are tensions going down? Is there violence in Gaza and so on? And you can simulate it. It's a video game. You can either build up the security wall, or you can bomb Gaza, or you can send aid to the Palestinians, or you can try to start negotiations. That's all if you're playing the Israeli side. Now, I spoke to, and they have the same thing on the Palestinian side. I spoke to dozens, maybe even hundreds of the people in this book, all of opinions on how to solve the conflict. I played this game at the beginning and almost immediately caused what they say is the third intifada. Apparently I'm no good at this game. After finishing all the interviews, I played again, and again caused the third intifada. And no matter what I do in the game, I would either cause the third intifada or get voted out of office. Now keep in mind, this is after speaking to real-life former Mossad spies, generals, diplomats, everyone, and all the stuff they told me, at least according to this game, doesn't work. And as you mentioned, I left my wife in the room to play this game, very pessimistic she'd have a better shot at it, and she managed to make peace. she hasn't been able to give me, and I came into the room and there was like music playing and flags waving on the screen, and I'm like, what the heck did you do here? Somehow she made peace, and I don't know. Perhaps it needs a female touch. I'm not sure.
Now, we've been talking about the Middle East participants. Now, let's talk about the United States and the White House officials that you encountered here, and what that was like for you when it came to trying to find a way to create peace in the Middle East.
Yeah. Well, I obviously didn't have a huge amount of access to the White House, but I was interviewed. I interviewed twice. One of the Middle East advisors to Barack Obama, but this was before the election. So then they were a little bit more open with access, of course. And it's interesting to see, their conceptions before and their conceptions after. During the book, I also emailed with him a little bit after, but they're sort of closed a bit more. But I spoke to somebody who was an advisor to Dick Cheney, Middle East advisor, and she said, "Okay, you're going to have the Obama folks at the beginning. They're going to be very, optimistic and hopeful, and they'll think that they have the answer, and everyone else has failed for whatever reason. And she said, well, wait a little while, and as they grapple with the situation, and she wasn't even just saying this from an ideological point of view. Mm-hmm. She was just saying it from the point of view of someone who had grappled with the situation. She said, wait a little while, and it just becomes an exercise in frustration. She said she had thrown up her hands during the Bush administration, and she was expecting the Obama officials to do the same, which hopefully they won't.
So what makes our government so persistent about a resolution in the Middle East? Because there are a lot of Americans, as I was mentioning earlier, is that, there's the national interest and then there's the real national interest when it comes to the United States. And it seems one particular interest is doing much different than what we really want to see happen. What's going on with that?
Yeah, it's a good question, why we persist. Because it just seems hopeless, like I said. I mean, the one overriding similarity between people I interviewed was, I'd say 75 or maybe 85% of them have given up. I mean, these are people actually involved with the process, and they just sort of push on, like pushing the boulder up the hill, knowing it's going to roll down. The other 15% are optimistic, perhaps. So why do we persist? And it's a good question. I don't really have an answer. I mean, the Middle East is important to the United States for geopolitical reasons, historical reasons, religious reasons. But this has been going on for a really long time. I think it's now, if you just talk about the occupation alone, it's the longest occupation in history or something very close to that. The situation is untenable. It's just getting worse. But I think to leave it to fester might lead to an even worse result. So, I think people just have to keep pushing on, but I'm not very optimistic that they're going to reach any conclusion to this.
Yeah, there are no easy answers, that's for sure.
There may not be any easy answers. There may be no answers, which is this sad, absurdist conclusion that I sort of come across in my book.
Because it seems that I think and this is just a possible perception of Americans, is that we're over there, we're, on the side of the Israelis, if you will, and the interest really is that we have somebody who's an ally with us to protect our rights, if you will, to the natural resources such as oil that are over there.
I mean, that's one argument. There's another argument for it's during the Cold War, especially. It was argued that you'd have a sort of a base for democracy there. There is the idea of oil. Oil really does. Oil's important, whether you like it or not. I don't like it, but it is. Then there's other things. There's sort of we have a huge in the United States religious block of people who support Israel for religious reasons, and I'm not talking about Jews, which is a minuscule number of the population. I'm talking largely about Christian population, evangelical Christians. That's a very big voting block, and it's a reason to support Israel. And of course, I support Israel too. I'm just looking at the reasons why the population does. And in the book, I actually went undercover. I'm like the most Jewish-looking person ever, but I went undercover as an evangelical Christian at the Christians United for Israel conference and sort of try to immerse myself in that world. And oil and things like that; those are certainly powerful forces, but so is religion and so is history. And actually, the oil lobby has never really been very pro-Israel. I mean, they'd much rather side with the Saudis, understandably.
Well, there certainly was a lot of chaos, and I know that, as you were saying, by the end of your book, you were saying, I couldn't wait to get away from this. Do you find your mind finally getting still now after you've written the book? I'm
sorry, do I find my mind?
Becoming still now that you're done with the book.
In a way. I mean, yeah, because after the first book, after my Shut Up, I'm Talking, the book about speechwriting for the Israeli government, I thought, like, okay, well, that happened. It was a very odd experience in my mid-20s, and I'm done with that, and I can go on with my life. And the whole premise of this book is, like, that I was not able to. People kept approaching me, kept pulling me back into the Middle East. And so this book's goal really was to try to reach that stillness, if you will, to escape it. And I think to some extent I did. I think I said somewhere in the book, if I can't make peace in the Middle East, and by the way, I'm not admitting I can't. If I can make peace in the Middle East, at least I can make peace with the Middle East.
Exactly.
And I think hopefully that's what I've done.
Now, as you've been on your book tour, you've been on radio, television, featured in magazines, newspapers, what have been, I guess, if you will, the negative impacts specifically from Americans, if you will, about what you've written? if any?
Well, this book hasn't actually. This book has just come out this week, so I haven't had any reaction yet. I mean, you're one of the first people I've spoken to.
Okay.
To the first book, though, I got a huge amount of different reactions to. I got some people who said, how come you can't criticize Israel and Israelis? They're our allies, or as a Jewish person, you can't criticize them, that sort of thing. But then I'd get tons of email from Israelis who loved the book, including from people in the Israeli government. So, you just take it as a mixed bag of stuff. I also, if you think about my first book, a lot of it is about concluding that I don't want to be involved in government or international relations or with the Middle East. That's the point. Mm-hmm. And I would get email after email, like one or two a week. It's about 200 at this point, asking me how, by kids like 21 years old, asking me how they can get involved in Israel and the UN and government and exactly the things which my book was saying, don't do this.
Right. Well, yeah, after you read the story, especially after Shut Up, I'm Talking, it's really, it becomes clear especially even after you read Peace in the Middle East, How to Make Peace in the Middle East in 6 months or less, is that you have, Americans, a broad spectrum of them, a fair majority of them getting their information from the news, which we know generally has its own slant in the first place, but they buy into that as a hardcore reality, as a truth. Mm-hmm. So I can imagine some of the arguments that you must have been in, you just kind of stand there and go, why am I even talking to you? Because you really aren't in the know as much as I've had to be, more than I really want to be.
Right, absolutely.
What I need to do is have you change places with me, then you come and you talk to me about your opinion, and I'm sure you're going to see something much different.
Absolutely, and everyone's so set in their own opinion. They'll have their 3 or 5 news sources, or with some of these people, it's like 70 news sources that they check religiously, but they're all exactly the same ideological slant. Someone who's a big MSNBC fan will never watch Fox, and someone who's a big Fox fan will never watch MSNBC, and then the ones who read the Israeli press will never read the Palestinian press, and they're so sure of themselves, and a million voices all sure of themselves, but all different. So I'm not sure of myself. I don't know what the answer is. I have no idea, but I do know that anyone who says they have the answer does not.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree with that, especially if you're only getting your information from a news source.
Yeah, exactly.
So what are your plans after this? Are you going to get back into the mix again, or are you just finally actually going to stay away like your wife told you to?
Yeah, I think she was very reluctant for me to write this second book. She said, I thought you were done with this, and I said, they pull me back in. But I would, I'm going to go out there and try to get the word out about this book like I need to, but after that, I think I'm done. I can't imagine being pulled back into anything more Middle East related, so I'd like to write another book about something else entirely. I don't know what. I hear Northern Ireland's nice. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, it's nice that you're finally going to take at least a little bit of a break out of this nonsense, it seems absolutely. Like. If you could, for our listeners, give out a website where they can find out more about this.
Sure. I think probably the best one to go to is, the best one to go to is probably my own website, which is www.gregorylevy, that's LEVEY.com. And there's reviews, and there will be an excerpt soon. So that's Gregory Levy, LEVEY.com.
Gregory Levy, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program. It was a lot of fun as last time.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. We also encourage you, the listeners out there, we want to thank you for tuning in. Again, the book is How to Make Peace in the Middle East in 6 months or less without leaving your apartment. Our guest, Gregory Levy. We thank you for tuning in. Be sure to visit us at our website at beyond50radio.com. That's the number 50, and sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.